Okay, thanks very much, Reza. So you've all seen in the program the panel discussion that we have set up for this part of the agenda. What we're aiming to do is to go through and hear from each of the panelists first for 5 minutes or so, for them to share their thoughts from their perspectives. I think you can yourself measure from looking at their bios, the diverse backgrounds they have, the diverse perspectives that they're able to bring. And then after they've sort of shared their thoughts, including online, of course, we're looking for them to, talk with each other, maybe challenge each other if there's some ideas, or build on some of the ideas that they've put forward, and then open it up for some comments from the floor. And hopefully, more comments that will continue to spark the discussion, take us to another level. This panel discussion is to help us think as we go into our workshops later about how we might do better or differently in terms of communicating our messages. So that's, I think, a key takeaway we want to get from our panelists today. And the first panelist is Dr. Sarah Viebeck, who's the Chief Science Officer of the Public Health Agency of Canada. And so, Dr. Viebeck, please take it away.
Good morning. Can folks hear me? How nice to be here with all of you in person in this gorgeous facility. You couldn't have picked a better location. So thank you very much for including me. And we were asked to reflect on really what makes a difference in communicating scientific evidence in the context of policy, what's particularly compelling when that happens. And so I'll offer a few reflections, and then I'll look forward to engaging with the other panelists. I think the first thing that I'd reflect on is that science is certainly a critical component of any credible, evidence-informed, emergency-ready health system and health organization. And at the Public Health Agency, we're one of a number of government departments which are considered science-based departments and agencies. And so science is fully integrated into the context of all that we do. That occurs both through our intramural science activities, but also through the engagement that we have with extramural scientists and where those two places meet, the extramural evidence that's generated as well as the intramural science. One of the best parts of public health, as you all know, is that it brings together mixed and multiple disciplines and mixed and multiple methodologies. And that is what makes, I think, our field incredibly rich and incredibly exciting to follow. It's also one of the things that makes our field incredibly hard to bring different sources and lines of evidence together into the formulation of cogent science advice for policy. And that's really a big part of my role. We know also that there are many different ways in which scientific evidence can be used and actually influence policy. Of course, that can include instrumental use, where science is directly informing and influencing a particular action, but it can also be conceptual in nature, where you're actually having your thinking influenced, and that becomes part of the overall policy evidence base. Within the context of COVID-19, I think it's important to note that there were massive disruptions in the systems of science. Many of you lived those. We saw not only the acceleration of the generation of evidence, but also changes in how it was used and how it influences policy. The rise in open science, which has made publications and made scientific evidence more accessible than arguably ever before. The systems and maturing of our science advice systems and architecture, both domestically and also internationally, and the advancements in need for living evidence syntheses, given the pace at which evidence is accruing and the pace at which the findings are actually changing alongside evolving epidemiology, alongside an evolving virus. Certainly in the context of environments and health research, which is where you're all situated, you're very familiar with those evolutionary practices and how scientific evidence both accrues but also evolves over time. Within the context of COVID, I'll offer a couple of reflections around the place of science and its use before turning over to other colleagues. One is around the critical importance of how to effectively and quickly synthesize evidence in a way that actually is conveying both the contextual nature of it and also ensuring that we've got bodies of evidence synthesized in a living way. And I want to really offer an acknowledgement of colleagues from the National Collaborating Centers for Public Health, many of whom are in the room today, who have played a really critically important part of our evidence ecosystem in the country for public health, bringing together diverse sources of evidence in a timely way to answer relevant questions for public health knowledge. So for both senior decision makers in government as well as in public health specifically, I think a few messages around the communication of science. One is that rarely is a single study going to actually influence the course of policy decision making. We want to see how those findings are situated in relation to a body of evidence. We have to understand what is known, but also what is not, the strength of the evidence in front of us, as well as how that evidence contains uncertainty to its confidence and the strength with which it's conveyed. I would encourage you to keep your communications around science simple, but not to oversimplify. And I would really encourage that you consider the audience and context into which your science and science advice is entering, and to develop a nuanced understanding of that through ongoing relationships. I'll close by saying that there's often a reputation for policy use of scientific evidence and for the integration of evidence into the policy cycle as being always needing to be fast. Policy works on this really fast time frame. While that may be true when a window actually opens, there are also many, many examples of where it's not. And so I would just encourage you to think about those ongoing communication activities as being as important as having just-in-time evidence available to respond. I'll look forward to the thoughts from others.
Starting remarks. I now want to turn to Dr. Corey Neudorf, professor at the University of Saskatchewan and the president of the Urban Public Health Network.
Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I'm in a position where I kind of try to straddle both worlds in being a researcher and a practitioner in public health. And in my role as president of UPHN, I just want to sort of set the context by saying that we're a network that has existed now for about 15 years to link local public health in large urban centers together across Canada for the purposes of sharing best practice, sharing challenges, possible solutions, and looking for innovative research projects that could be done to improve public health and improve the population's health in urban environments. And as such, over the years, we've found increasingly that we're being approached by researchers and research teams to play that kind of partnership role. Some of those partners are in the room today. And what we found where those partnerships are the most productive is, first of all, where researchers have come to the local public health practitioners early on with research ideas, or even before that, to generate what are the research ideas that are of interest or important to local public health, and hopefully with a diversity of those local partnerships, because in public health, obviously, there's virtually nothing that we do that's by ourselves. It's usually in partnership with many, many different sectors. So coming early on, co-developing those research ideas and questions and being partners in that research, certainly in the knowledge translation as well. But the results of that research, giving key messages that can be used, can be parroted, use local public health in a way to get that message out. We've got a few examples where we've done research projects and actually then had locally relevant data that was shared ahead of time to the providers such that we could coordinate a media message across all major cities with locally relevant data at the same time. And it really amplifies the message and gets an issue across that can, be more effectual with policy change, certainly. So using that local public health voice to amplify the message. To do that, we need local data. We need granular information, linkable data, as Senator Greenwood said, accessible, local, granular data that really makes sense to the local people and local politicians where possible. We use that kind of data. Certainly then we'll take those research studies and other data and use it for local health status reports. We'll use it in environmental health chapters or focused reports. We'll use it for planning interventions to improve health or decrease risks. But we often use it in conjunction with that data then as a set of recommendations that are either aimed at local health system, local public health, often with municipalities and civic government, provincial and federal government as well. So we turn this data into recommendations, and that's often drawing upon that local research to put those forward. And what's the purpose? I mean, often when we're communicating that message, what we're trying to do is, yes, influence politicians, but we're also trying to influence the public to say, this is an issue, you should be interested in this, you should be aware, we need something to change, and can we get public opinion to shift so that we also is that we can act as a place to actually ground the research and make it more locally relevant by having it as an applied research or an intervention research initiative. So as much as possible, we're looking to turn those findings into an ongoing research program to show this is an issue, these are the potential solutions, and now we're starting to generate evidence of effectiveness of how that can be translated and amplified in different contexts and different communities. So that's where that partnership is really important. And so I'll stop there and listen to what others have to say as well. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Corey. So we've gone from hearing about national level to how things connect at the local level. Now I want to turn to Dr. Melissa Lamb, Director of PARX, Board President of the Canadian Association for the Physicians of the Environment. Thank you, Melissa.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Okay, so I'm going to use these next 5 minutes. There we go. Part pep talk, part evidence, part case studies. Because I'm a family doctor, my day job is as a family doctor, and I'm all about putting science into practice. So I want to say that the people in this room are probably the best placed people to communicate these findings to the public, because if you look at this Ipsos poll that's run out of France every single year of global trustworthy professions, as you can see at the top, doctors are #1, nurses tend to rank up there as well, and scientists are #2. So if you happen to be a scientist and a doctor, you have basically hit the jackpot in terms of global trustworthiness ranking. Next slide, please. And also, framing policy proposals in terms of health is really effective. So there's a bunch of evidence looking at different frames and how they affect support for public policy. And this is just a study, it was actually officially published last year, that looked at research around climate change and policy proposals. So they did surveys with over 7,500 participants in over 5 countries. And they asked these participants to read 5 pages of statements and ask them which would make them more likely to support policies tackling climate change. And so these frames included health, environmental, migration, economy. And they found when they used the health frame and environmental framing to propose or to frame these policy proposals, this significantly increased support for those proposals. Economic framing actually had no effect. So if you think about how often we hear from government and the media, this is going to affect the economy or won't affect the economy, the average person actually doesn't care that much about the economy. Also, opportunity framing increased support more than threat framing. So these are all the positives that will happen if we put this policy proposal into place. And focusing on present impacts was more motivating than focusing on future impacts. So that's something that I try to do in my work, that CAPE and the BC Parks Foundation often try to do, is focus on current health impacts and opportunities in this public policy messaging, because for the average person, it's much more motivating to change their behavior. But the thing is, how do we get this message in front of people? You know, it's all well and good to communicate this, but what if they're not listening, or what if they don't hear about it? Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you examples of 2 different case studies where we took campaigns that were based in the science and got a lot of media attention and moved policymakers and moved the public. So this is one of my personal heroes. Her name is Dr. Lori Adamson. She's an ER physician in Salmon Arm. And I remember vividly our CAPE BC meeting. So we have monthly meetings where we talk about what's going on in the province and what kind of campaigns we want to put together. And she raised the point that, in fact, her son, who you can see in the picture there, brought home some materials from Fortis BC, which is the largest natural gas distributor in the province, extolling the virtues of natural gas and these kind of science lessons that were based in natural gas. And she was absolutely horrified. And I've been telling stories, I've been working in this field for over a decade now. Immediately I thought, this is the basis for a campaign. And so working with Kate BC and working with Lori, we put together a campaign to ban fossil fuel promotion by Fortis BC in BC schools, highlighting the science behind the health and climate harms of LNG extraction and use. And we managed to gain almost 100 organizational signatories, including, this is key, the BC Teachers Federation and Vancouver Island Health Authority. We generated national media coverage, so a picture of the provincial environment minister was front and center in the Globe and Mail, the education minister, and she ended up, based on public pressure, meeting with stakeholders and rights holders to review and revise BC's education resources policy. And in fact, as of this date, so this is 1 year later, Fortis BC removed the Energy Leaders curriculum from its website, and it's still off their website under annual review. So a year later, obviously it's not an annual review, obviously it was our campaign that had that impact. Next slide, please. And then I want to talk about my favorite thing, which is PARX, Canada's National Nature Prescription Program, and it's again a program that's grounded in science and evidence behind the connection between nature and health. And it was just over a year ago that we announced our collaboration with Parks Canada, which led to over 90, in the first month after the announcement, over 90 national and international media pieces, which reached over 200 million people globally, and to date, about a year later, over 6 billion media impressions. This program was endorsed by the Canadian Medical Association at COP15 in Montreal, the UN Biodiversity COP, which is the first time a national physicians organization has endorsed a nature prescribing program. And to date, we have over 10,000 prescribers. So these are all regulated health professionals within Canada, registered and prescribing nature in our program, including over 5% of all physicians in the country. And if you're a physician or you know physicians, you know they're pretty slow to adopt new policy changes and new practices. So the fact that we have that volume is pretty incredible. And again, an indication of the impact that we're having. Next slide, please. So from being in the trenches, from looking at the research, these are some of my key messages when you want to successfully translate knowledge to impact. So number one, you want to refine the message. So it's much more likely that media will pay attention if it's something new and it's something that's applicable to the everyday person, which Corey alluded to. Also, if you want your message to get the media's attention and the public's attention, it should be timely, so kind of hooking on to current trends and news stories. Controversy is another thing that gets attention, and so in the case of the BC Teachers Federation campaign, it was a bit controversial, and we kind of leaned into that a bit to get more media attention. And you want to present the evidence, but you also want to ground it in story. So every time we put together a press release or a communication strategy, we make sure there's a credible and a believable and also sympathetic person at the front of it, or family at the front of it, who can speak to media about the evidence and also how it's affected their own life. And I want to underline the importance of partnering effectively. So you want to make sure you establish those intersectoral partnerships, because we can't get this done alone in our own ivory towers or silos. You want to make sure that the partners you choose are relevant. So example, with the BC Teachers Federation, we made sure that it was teachers speaking to the impacts of fossil fuel education on their students. And it's really important also to, again, step outside of the ivory tower, connect with community and advocacy groups, to make sure you're acting in a way that addresses community needs, and they're really creative people, so they can amplify your science and messaging in creative ways. And one other suggestion I have is don't view media as scary or unfriendly, because they have a huge role to play in disseminating the message and moving public opinion and moving political opinion. Next slide, please. I'm just going to end with this quote from the legendary Dr. Cindy Blackstock, who's a scholar and advocate. And in the last week or two, there was an article featuring an interview with her in University Affairs where she said, don't just publish another paper, let's do something. Something else she said in that interview was that academia needs to hire more people who are willing to get into trouble. So this is my invitation to you and encouragement to you to start getting into some good trouble. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Okay, that's a challenge. We take that as a challenge, I think. Okay, very good. Okay, now we're going to turn online. I would say we've sort of seen there, what can happen when you get into the trenches and become take more of an activist role, maybe get into trouble. And I would like to now hear from Dr. Joel Kaufman, who's a professor at the University of Washington and editor-in-chief of the Environmental Health Perspectives. So we're now turning to a couple of our international guests, and I think it's really a great compliment to this panel to hear from that other side about publishing papers, but what they do in that paradigm of making these papers even sing more to the audiences and the right stakeholders. So hopefully we can hear everything good technically, Joel, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, so let's see. What I was going to introduce myself a little bit as an environmental health scientist, practicing general internist out here in Seattle, professor at the University of Washington, and since 2020 have been the editor-in-chief of Environmental Health Perspectives, which I guess to respond to the last speaker, closing comments is a place where people go to publish another journal article. So I guess that's what we do. We're a 50-year-old scholarly journal published with the support of the U.S. National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, which is one of the institutes of the U.S. National Institutes of Health. And our mission is to advance knowledge, contribute to public health through timely publication and effective dissemination of high-impact scientific content. Our focus really is on mostly on trying to identify and publish papers that we think are going to be original, either research, reviews, or commentaries on anything that we feel meets the scope of the journal in terms of the environment and human health. So we're working to attract, publish high quality research from all the disciplines, from toxicology, epidemiology, environmental chemistry to community engaged research. And then we try to communicate and promote the research findings and knowledge to a broad array of stakeholders. And we see part of our mission to be to foster development of an innovative, diverse, and international community of contributors in the environmental health sciences. Now, as a highly selective journal, we're publishing about 8% or less of the submissions that we get. So we are, pretty picky in what we're publishing in terms of trying to find things that are novel, moving the science, and are likely to be impactful. And a large part of our work is trying to make sure that the things we publish are published with scientific rigor, transparency about what they've done, and somehow novel, moving the field forward. So being a journal is, people are familiar with scholarly journals. We're in a special position with the support of the US NIH to allow us to focus on the environmental health sciences and be, a bit choosy in what we choose to publish.
great. We'll be definitely coming back to you to get more of your perspectives on the role that the journal can play and other thoughts you have. But I now want to turn to Dr. Evelyn DeLue, who is speaking to us from Australia in the middle of the night or very early in the morning there. So we're very appreciative that you've taken on the challenge of getting up early and joining us. So Evelyn is a professor of urban health and policy and a director of the Urban Health Environments Collaboratory at the University of New South Wales and the Australia Research Centre for Primary Healthcare and Equity. And we first met Evelyn as she was helping us shape some research directions within CANUE, and we've been maintaining this relationship ever since. So we really appreciate you joining us, Evelyn, and look forward to hearing your comments.
I'm going to share my screen. Oh, it says here, my screen cannot be shared. Okay. Can someone enable my participant screen sharing, please? Yes, here we go. Share, and this is it. So a little bit of an introduction to myself and the topic that I want to spend my 5 minutes on. I'm in the urban health business since 1986 when I joined the WHO Euro effort on healthy cities, the first international healthy cities movement in the world, partly inspired, of course, by Canada. And I've been helping WHO in Europe evaluating healthy cities. A very diverse network, over 57 different member states of the European region of WHO. And one of the biggest challenges is that healthy cities in Europe is not about the outcome, better health, it is about the process. And the designated process of healthy cities in Europe is to put health high on social and political agendas, with the assumption that if you do that, that health outcomes and health processes will automatically follow. Now, how do you evaluate that? That is an incredible challenge, and it involves a lot of networking. I'll come back to that in my brief discussion. The other thing that I've been doing over the last 5 years here in the Greater Sydney area is run a collaboratory within Maridulu Budiara Gumal, which is the Sydney Partnership for Health Education, Research and Enterprise. Maridulu Budiara Gumal is the indigenous name. And we collaborate between 3 different universities with very different structures and missions, 2 local health districts, both the size of Belgium, and a number of top-level medical research institutes. And very soon after we established ourselves, we found that none of these partners actually impact urban health. You know, we can think about urban health, but we don't impact urban health. That's the Department of Transport, local governments. So it was our role, we defined, to reach out to all of the stakeholders and try to figure out how we would do work from an academic and local health service perspective that would be meaningful to them. One of the simple things that a lot of people would think and tell us is that we need more information. Now, as an example, this is the information that you could provide in infographic form on active transport. And we all know that active transport, multimodal physical activity, transport is good for health on many levels. And you can make as many pamphlets as you want and communicate them as elegantly to anyone that is out there. It does not make a difference. What makes a difference is bedding down the connections between the different partners in this game. So our mantra, both in Healthy Cities in Europe and in Maridule Budiara Gumal, is we don't need more problems. We don't need to share that there are issues that need to be resolved. We don't need more solutions. That has been my mantra until a couple of years ago. We don't need more problems, we need more solutions. Actually, what we need is connections, and we need to firm up and sustain the connections between academia, between health services, between various sources of research in the private sector, but also in the public sector, between local governments, between government sectors, public transport, infrastructure, etc., etc. Now, establishing connections is a challenge. And how do you do this? Well, we wrote a book, and actually we wrote this book with a bunch of your Canadian colleagues, Patrick Fafard and Adèle Cassola, on politics and public health, because it's not that simple. Policy is political, and remember, politics is the art of deciding and influencing who gets what, why, and where. If you want to run partnerships between all of these complex entities, they are always contested and contestable. People always claim that the other party does not trust you, or is untrustworthy, or that there are challenges on bears in the road. So how do you deal with that? Is to listen, mostly listen. And academics are often, even though you would think that that is the key of our trade, academics are very bad at listening to random facts, because we think that they're random facts. But random facts from stakeholders are really, really important. And then you need to respond to those facts, not to the wisdom that you think you have created. You need to respond, and you need to create and shape all sorts of different alternatives. And this is a political theory by John Kingdon, who says the alternative specification, the art of framing the same truth in different responses to the needs of different stakeholders, is really where you start shaping policy. Now, that is an issue, and ultimately what we are struggling with is this. And if you know Asterix and Obelix, ultimately they have a party at in the village square, and everything is oxydozy. And that's what we need to aim for. And let's not avoid this conflict. Listen and respond. And I'm happy to engage with you in your discussion much later in my night.
Great, Evelyn. That was really, really complimentary to everything we've heard so far. So I really appreciate that quite a bit. And I want to now turn to Carolyn Jarvis. So I certainly take Melissa's advice to heart and say, you know, befriend the media and develop a good friend in the media. And Carolyn and I have been interacting for a while now, and we seem to be able to get each other's responses by email pretty quickly, which I greatly appreciate. And I'm always thinking about stories that might interest her. Often not that successful, but we want to hear from her how we might, you know, connect with the media, you know, to get the information out, to get it out to, you know, the public to hear about it, to get it out, of course, to the politicians to hear about it. So we all know the media is a really, really critical role in all of this. And Carolyn has had some great impacts in her work. So I really look forward to hearing from her. Carolyn is the Chief Investigative Correspondent from Global News. So Carolyn, thanks for joining us, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks for having me, Jeff. Let me just, first of all, disclose I'm using my AirPods today, and they're really touch and go. So if you have difficulty hearing me, or if they're patchy, somebody throw their hands up. I can see the panel, so let me know, and I'll flip to speakerphone. So I'm an investigative journalist, and usually when people get an email or a phone call from me, they freak out. I think that they're in trouble. But let's go back to what Melissa said a few minutes ago, and that journalists aren't scary. In fact, if you're at the forefront of some incredible research, I want to know about it. And we can be incredible partners in hopefully accelerating policy change. And we've seen that happen in recent years. Jeff and I, for example, he was a great source of counsel and insight and data analysis when for 2.5 years, we looked at the effects of industrial pollution in the South Sarnia area, an area that's known as Chemical Valley, and the Aamjiwnaang First Nation that's on the south side of the community. We spent 2.5 years developing relationships with the First Nation, with the communities there, delving into what people were concerned about. And what we produced in partnership with the Toronto Star and several local universities was the largest collaborative project of its time of journalists called The Price of Oil. That was one of several pieces we did 24 hours after we aired that documentary about what was happening in Sarnia and the impacts of the people living there, and a massive, massive trove of, oh gosh, how many pages? 3,000 pages of FOIs that we got after a year and a half of brokering back and forth with the department. We established a pattern of leaks of spills and fugitive emissions that were happening, that were impacting these local communities. 24 hours after we aired that documentary, the government committed, the provincial government committed to funding a health study, which a local advocacy group had been campaigning for a decade. It's now a health review, not quite a study, but change did happen, and it happened quickly. Also, people within the ministry told us that for years they've been trying to push forward a new SO2 regulation, and boom, that regulation went out the door, went pushed forward. We saw benzene standards change really quickly, though there was a bit of a loophole in the technical standard, I would admit. They did move that forward also. So things can change in partnerships with journalists for the better of the public. We can bring issues to light in partnership with scientists, and we want to make those things happen. So here are 5 key takeaways from me as a journalist, hoping that we can bridge the divide with scientists. One is that it always starts with relationships, that 90% of the stuff I get in my inbox from people are from communication staff or PR people. And if there's any in the room, thank you for your emails, but usually they go into my junk box. That's because everything that I do usually starts with a relationship with somebody. And so if you don't have a journalist in your corner already, I would recommend that you build that. And it doesn't always have to happen when you have something that's ready, baked, and set to go. That developing relationships is really what mattered. That's why when Jeff calls me up when he's doing something, I always put aside what I'm doing to listen and to hear what he's doing, because maybe that's my next story. And a journalist is always looking for their next project. But develop relationships of trust. So if you don't have a journalist in your corner right now, look at who's covering your beat. There are increasingly climate change reporters across the country. I can think of Marco Chonovid at the Toronto Star. I can think of the great work at the Narwhal right now, the Tyee out west, for example. Across the country, we've got Cam Razavi, who is a PhD candidate doing environment and climate change reporting. Media outlets are developing reporters with this beat, or maybe it's a health reporter that you're looking for, and develop relationships with them such that when something big happens, you already know who to go to with that information. I wouldn't rely solely on your communications or your PR department to be the vehicle to get your story out. So when I go to my editor, once I've got a pitch from somebody, I can always expect 2 questions are going to come my way. Number 1 is, what are the pictures? Because I work in television. And number 2 is, why will anybody care? So let's start with the first one. If you work in print media and you've got a study that's published and it's all ready to go, you can probably run a story on that. But if you were to come to somebody who works for me, I file for Global National frequently, or somebody who works on CBC The National or CTV National, they're going to say, well, how do I visualize that? And that starts with capturing the process. People often think, well, I've got to wait until this is totally done. I can write my summary, my conclusion, and publish something and say, ta-da. That's not when I want to start the process. I want to start it where the science is happening, because that's what's exciting. And often I find scientists will say to me, well, I can't have a journalist interfere with the process because that might disrupt its integrity. But everybody has a camera today. Everybody. And so if you're launching air balloons, if you're doing soil studies, if you're, setting up SUMA canisters to check air quality, that's when you want to capture the images. And that can happen in partnership with the journalist who you brought in really early, under an understanding that everything is embargoed and contingent upon the publication of your work. Nobody wants to interfere with that. Or you can capture those images yourself so that when you're putting out your study, you have a body of visuals to go with it. That will really help elevate the chances that your work will have traction when you're trying to meet audiences. The second question for my editor, if we loop back to that, is why will anybody care? And this comes down to the heart of it. And Melissa was talking about this earlier, is that you got to connect with the human element. And so oftentimes we get so big into the data, and trust me, I love data as much as Corey does. I love data. But my editors will say to me, but why do I care? And that can be really tricky because there isn't always causation. You know, when, for example, if we use the sarnia example, you know, we know that it's a class 1 carcinogen and that it can cause blood cancers, but I can't say Jimmy has cancer because of the fugitive emissions of benzene that came off the factory that's 200 meters from his house. But we can hold them up next to each other, or we can look at public health data and look at cancer rates across, you know, at the postal code level, for example. So it can be hard to find causation, but if we can always look for the heart in something, again, it will have a greater chance of having traction and getting off the page. And then who delivers the message matters. And this also comes back to what Melissa says. I feel like we're a bit of an echo chamber here about who is credible. You know, there was nothing more frustrating for me than when I worked on the Hill many moons ago under the Harper government, with no challenge to politics here, but not being able to speak to scientists as a journalist was just a hair-pulling exercise. I think we all remember that time. If you were in Ottawa at that time, it was brutal. But when something is published or something's about to be, there's nobody I want to speak to more than a doctor. With the greatest respect to people who are in communications, I don't want them at the microphone. I don't want to see them in the lab. I want to talk to the physician. I want to speak to the scientist who's doing it, because nobody will be more passionate than them. And when I ask the question that is perhaps a little bit more probing, they're bound to know the answer, whereas a communications person won't. So to recap the 5 things that I think are keys to getting traction on your project so that you can get media attention, so that hopefully you can push that policy change forward, perhaps a little quicker, are developing relationships, building trust, capturing the process with visuals, communicating the heart of the story so that people care, and sharing it with passion. Don't let anybody else do it for them. And pitch stories, because we want to hear them. Even if you might not think it's that important, trust me, there's somebody else who does.
Thanks very much, Carolyn. So now we're going to, I think, turn to just more of an open discussion. We've heard some viewpoints, some ideas, some advice, I think, from many different perspectives, which I'm really happy to have heard. And you know, before I try to maybe get the conversation going with a question, and I made a mistake and I didn't ask you guys if you had any questions you'd like me to ask, but that's okay. Are there, you know, any things from maybe from the 3 of you that you heard from one of the others in particular that you wanted to pick up on as a start? Maybe we'll go there. If not, we can go to the audience or to myself.
I actually have a question for the researchers, the knowledge generators. And my question is what your views are on advocacy groups like CAPE, or, you know, like the BC Parks Foundation and Park Prescriptions, when we have a very clear objective. And sometimes we always strive to be evidence-based, but we always are using the knowledge in a certain way. So I'm wondering what your impressions are, and then also if you'd be more open to working with advocacy groups like us to get those messages across.
That's a difficult one. Go ahead, Corey.
Yeah, I can kind of start as from the perspective of someone who tries to do both. There are cautionary tales, I guess. It depends on the group is what I'd say, because sometimes a group that's trying to be an advocate is doing so with a purpose of trying to engender interest in the public and raise something of controversy, but may not be a group that's credible or trusted or invited into the policy table and the decision making. And other groups are more focused on that and less so on getting the public voice. And so it really depends what stage you're at and who it is you need to be working with, depending on how close you are to getting something, to getting change happening. So one group might be really necessary to work with at the beginning stage and trying to raise and elevate the issue, but they might be the wrong group when you're really close to making a change within government. So I think the one advice that I'd give is to work in collaboration then with those who may be at different stages and say, how could my voice as an advocate or as an advocacy group be more helpful and not harmful depending on the policy cycle and the stage that we're with, is what I've found.
Thanks. Sarah, you wanted to add something or a separate comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect on some of the commentary related to listening and trying to situate and understand the context into which your evidence is entering. And there are many cues that government sends around what matters on the agenda at a given point in time. And those may be very familiar to you, or they may not be, so I'm going to mention them. I would definitely say that the public posting of ministerial mandate letters gives you a sense of what is on an individual minister's agenda. That gets reinforced, of course, through other policy communication mechanisms, including the speech from the throne or the budget. When you're trying to think about how that relates to individual departments, that gets reinforced through our departmental plans. So within our departmental plans, which some of you may have read, some of you may never have read, that gives you a signal for what's on a department's agenda for a given year. And that doesn't mean that only those things will be addressed, but it does tell you that these things will definitely be addressed unless something significant changes. So when you're thinking about the timing, and when you're thinking about the relevance, and when you're thinking about the different departments that you may wish to engage from different lenses, those are some, I think, particular areas where before you even have a conversation with an official, sends you a pretty clear signal around priorities.
Great, thank you. You know, to that point you raised, Melissa, about getting involved with advocacy, to me, we've got this dichotomy now where we're hearing more and more that the work needs to be done at the community level, working at, with community groups. And I think that almost pretty well puts you in the point where you need to be now working with advocates at that level. So it seems unavoidable. Maybe we don't have the model totally figured out as to what the role of the scientist would be in terms of being vocal versus the community groups and providing the information. But it seems essential in this day and age. Anyone online want to share some thoughts about working with advocacy groups from the researcher's perspective? So one of the things that I noted hearing, I think, from Corey and also from Evelyn, was certainly the role of interventions, but evaluation is a key role, and that is a very challenging topic. Of course, we're creating whole fields around that. But one of the things I've noted is that often the time it takes for something you've done in intervention to come to the point where there's something to measure, to evaluate, if you've been had the foresight to put those measurements in place, often outstrips the time of whoever it is that's really paying attention to the issue, because things move so fast. And I think there's two things that can help us there, and one, of course, would be try to keep the attention longer so that people are paying attention, making sure, of course, you've put in place the measures to track the changes, but also trying to speed up the way in which we collect data to try to evaluate. And I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on ways we might try to do that in this evaluation, which is so important. We hear about it, whether it's called, interventions in evaluation or implementation science, or in the air quality field, we hear a lot about the term accountability. Oh, we've got to have accountability and we've got to show accountability. Or in other fields, adaptive management. We're going to evaluate, we're going to adapt. But the cycle is, I think, not really been so fleshed out to be able to have it really go through the cycle. And I'm not sure what your thoughts are in that in the intervention or evaluation stage.
Yeah, I could start. I think certainly one of the steps that we look for is with research early on, thinking about an evaluability assessment of the work that you're doing. Can I build in those elements in the research early on so it becomes more evaluable as it gets to different stages? And what I've been challenged often by policymakers is to think through those stages of evaluation where early progress or indicators of success might be more readily available even early on. So you're not waiting for the penultimate evaluation or outcome, but you can show steps along the way. And the last point for me would be beware of the results of a research getting out there as a one-time thing to say, okay, well, I finally got my results, I'm making this impact on government, now they're going to have to act. You know, this is it. Well, you know, after 2 days and the news cycle is over, and you know what's actually been promised, and does it have longevity? One of the things I've commented on with government sometimes, I word it as a promise. I'll be generating this data again in a few years so I can see the impact of your policy response. That's a promise. It can also be viewed as a threat, but the idea that this isn't going away, and we know that a single response may or may not be sufficient to get the aim we're looking for. So we're going to be promising to keeping on analyzing the issue, the problem, and the degree to which the solutions have actually had the impact can be a great motivator as well, I would say.
Thoughts from others? Evelyn, okay.
Yeah. You raised a very important point about time. I also happen to be an editor of the online Encyclopedia of Public Health of Oxford University Press, and we commission papers. We try to figure out what we know and what we don't know, and invite people to reflect on things. And I invited one of the world's experts on time in health promotion to tell us what we know about time. How much time does it take to plan an intervention? How much time do you need to evaluate it? How much time then is required to implement it? And amazingly, there is very little or no evidence on time as a resource. And we all know that whatever work we do, time is a resource, and it is created through funding mechanisms. It's created through the support that we get from all sorts of partners and stakeholders, and we know almost nothing about it. So if there's one thing that we need to invest more time and money in, is research into time.
I'm thinking about that one. I totally agree. I have this vision that in this world of big data where ChatGPT doesn't take any time to answer a question, how we can harness that in a good way. And I'm certainly, there are ways to harness the big data world out there for evaluating interventions. Another thing that resonated with me, and then we'll turn it to the audience. So if those have questions, I think we have a mic that can go around the room, or comments. So if you have a question, raise your hand. And there's one online. Okay, great. Thank you. Line. Go ahead.
Oh, am I up? Hi, I'm Alison McPherson from York University, and I'm primarily an injury prevention researcher, not an environmental researcher. But our group has been really interested in active transportation and sustainable transportation. And in the city of Toronto, we've had a lot of success by involving what we call policymakers at the beginning of the research journey. So not before we submit our grants, we ask them, what questions would you like to answer? And that's been a super productive approach. And they're very happy to give us data. They're happy to pay us to evaluate their interventions, such as separated bike lanes. So I think Carolyn mentioned the relationship part. I think that's so critical and so important that researchers have to put the time and effort into developing those relationships and sustaining them, and sometimes doing stuff that maybe wouldn't be our original research question, but is really important to our stakeholders. So I found that approach really has been successful.
Any follow-up from our panel on that perspective?
I got one quick thing to say on that, Jeff. In that, just to follow up the note of relationships, is that oftentimes you might think, oh, well, that person, say for example, you came to me right now, all I report on is child welfare. You might say, oh, well, if I'm not working in the child welfare space, I want to do sustainable transportation. once you have a relationship with a journalist, often people come to me with stories and I can filter them through the network. So, and Frank, don't tell my bosses this, I hope they're not there. But sometimes it's filtering you to somebody who's not even in my network. So you might come to me and I'll say, okay, great. I know somebody that does transportation at the Star, where, you know, if you've been in the industry long enough, you can just make those connections. So even if you have one person where you have a really trusting relationship, they can open those pathways to others.
Thanks. And go ahead, Melissa.
So, you know, CAPE is a reasonably funded advocacy organization, doesn't have as much funding as universities or you know, the government. But I want to mention that in terms of the stories that we put out, the campaigns that we put out that have gotten a lot of attention, relationships were so important. So in addition to, you know, working with CAPE and being a family doctor and with the BC Parks Foundation, I've also been kind of a media commentator and expert for over 10 years. And so I've collected quite a Rolodex of different media experts, not experts, but journalists. And so whenever I have a story that comes out from BC CAPE or from the BC Parks Foundation, I can send it to they're basically like, they're like friends. I've met them in person, you know, I've spent time with them. And then they amplify it, and then those people and their colleagues see it and amplify it. So it is really, really important, again, to make friends with journalists like Carolyn, because they really do have an impact. And, you know, the park prescription story, it was a local journalist friend, colleague that I had who first broke the story, and then it just went viral. So yeah, again, underlying the importance of befriending people outside of your sphere of work.
Another comment online from Chris Carlston. So Chris, if you can hear me, take it away.
Hey, Jeff. Hi, everyone. Sorry I couldn't be there. I'm Chris Carlston at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. You said to be controversial, so or at least provocative, perhaps. I just thought I'd mention that the admonition for the journalists to be cautious about the I guess the reputation and expertise of the groups they're working with has the converse, right? That for scientists, they have to also be very cautious about the groups that they're willing to work with. And, you know, it may be one of those things that's potentially crude to say, but it's also true that different advocacy groups have different levels of rigor, I guess, in their in how they view the science and how far they're willing to stretch it. So I think it's a two-way relationship. And I just thought, in fairness, because we're trying to promote the best use of science, we have to all be careful about it on both sides of the equation, because we all want the best science to be represented accurately and used appropriately. And I think if we're not aware of that, it just hurts everyone. So I just thought I'd add that because it maybe balances the perspective, and you did say to be provocative.
You have thoughts on that? I see Corey's nodding. I think it's definitely a real challenge. And, you know, what's the line you cross and how you convey your work?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we try to do in public health is develop coalitions to get messages across. And I think innate in the work that we do in developing community capacity and developing partnerships is you're giving up some control of how that's used. And I think all you can do as a credible source of information is try to make sure that your research is communicated in a way that's really clear and less likely to be misunderstood or misused by a group. But it is difficult to see sometimes when a group that may have put out unreliable information or misinformation latches onto your work all of a sudden, and you can get tainted by that role. But you're giving up some control, and I think it's necessary in order to get the message out. So the best we can do is just, as I say, being really clear and trying to make sure that the messages aren't open to that kind of misunderstanding. I think it's worth the risk personally, because I think we really have to be making sure the messages are out there and as much as possible being picked up by a very diverse audience.
Thank you. Thank you. I see Megan over there has a comment or a question. Or what am I seeing?
Yeah.
And Joel wants to follow up with that. Okay.
Oh, do you want Joel's?
That's, can you hear me, Joel? You
I hear
to
you.
follow up on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll take my editor hat off and as a, put my academic hat on here, which is that I think that, community engagement of academic scientists is an incredibly important part of what we do in environmental health and needs to be encouraged at all steps. But what we have to recognize as an academic or as a community organization or as a journalist is that each of these three parties have, or as a public health official, have different agendas, and you need to respect those agendas and work with them in a way that is helpful to them and not getting in their way. At the same time, they need to recognize the boundaries about what an academic scientist can and can't say, because we're, from the academic side, our credibility is incredibly important to our, livelihood and our ability to maintain the rigor of what we do and not sort of step out beyond what we think what we believe in based on the science, while other parties often have a different agenda for very good reasons, and that's all. It's all for the better. We actually have we work with community organizations and have a kind of a little agreement that we work out with community organizations about what we can and can't do, and what we're willing to help with, and what's required if you want sort of our name on communication or something like that. So that's all I would say.
Great perspective. Megan?
Thanks. I'm Megan Winters. I'm a CIHR Applied Public Health Chair, Gender and Sex in Healthy Cities, and a co-lead of Interact of the Environmental Health Signature Initiatives. I guess where I wanted to just sort of probe the panel or push them is, as an academic researcher, I hold, in applied research, I hold very close relationships with city staff across the country in various cities, long-term relationships that I've cultivated and am careful about. But recently, I think possibly with Melissa, I had to speak out against one of the cities that I work with in terms of the city of Vancouver and its failure to put in plan for active transportation along the Broadway corridor as we reinvest $10 million in a 8-kilometer road. So I guess in that place, I want to just, as we talk about relationships, is when you need to speak out against the person or decisions being made by the organization that is that relationship that you're in. And I guess I'd like to hear from the panel just that more nuance. So it's great to say we need to have relationships. Actually, the harder place is when you need to sort of threaten that relationship in some kinds and really speaking out against them. And I'm sure as public health officials and decision makers, you have experience in that, but sort of, I'd like to hear your reflections on that aspect of it.
Anyone want to tackle that first? I see Sarah.
Thanks, Megan, and really pleased to see you here, and thank you for your leadership. I guess one reflection that goes back to roles within the ecosystem, and I think one of the very privileged roles of an academic is to be able to speak with independence. And so regardless of relationships, which may be difficult to navigate, but I think that credibility to be able to speak for the evidence with independence is a really critical part of an academic-based researcher. And so I think that's just part of your role, as difficult as it may be, and part of, I think, the relationship is ensuring that there's shared understanding of the fact that is a part of your role.
Can I quickly add
Evelyn
to that?
wants to comment there? Okay, we can't hear you, Evelyn.
Yeah. Because it's our duty. It's our moral duty to be advocates, and we don't just create evidence. We really want to create change, and we need to speak truth to power. And I think that should be in any job description of any academic.
Academics, especially particularly tenured academics versus practitioners or public health officers. Unfortunately, there have been a lot of examples of physicians, public health officers who have been fired because they dared to speak out with the evidence that had been mounting and convey it to the public. So in some ways, you academics who are tenured have a lot more leeway than we do to speak to the evidence, because your job will not be threatened. So I think, because of the credibility of your voice, because you're based in science, you know the details, it's almost even more important for you to speak out, because you'll still have a job waiting for you typically at the end of it. So I would encourage you to do that.
Thanks for that encouragement. Is that Jennifer there?
Yeah. Hi, it's Jen Gommerman from the University of Toronto. So I'm a tenured researcher, as just pointed out, and I just wanted to flag that a lot of us were involved in research during COVID-19. I'm an immunologist, and brought evidence to the public through social media, through a lot of very effective conventional media representation. But where I think we hit a wall was at conveying what needed to happen to government entities. And I don't know, as a researcher, and I really appreciate the comment about time, I don't know how to breach that gap as a researcher, so that what we are discovering, what we are communicating pretty tirelessly gets translated to policy. And I, as a basic immunologist, don't know how that works. And is that something that CIHR can help us with? Like, who does that?
That's a good question. Is there, I see some CIHR people in the room. I guess I ask you again, what's your perspective of policy? Because I often think, well, it could be not, like a policy, like a law, but a policy.
Or even just targeted funding for something that really needs to happen quickly. So I can give you an example that's really my own, and so it's a little bit bespoke. But a lot of colleagues working on mucosal vaccines had been advocating and getting media coverage that this needs to happen. My colleagues in the US were able to just walk over to Capitol Hill and have a whole day summit where they spoke to representatives in Congress. How does this happen in Canada? How do researchers bridge that gap? Maybe there's a way and I just don't know, but I'd be curious to hear your feedback on that.
I'll just answer.
Hopefully I don't get fired.
Yeah. I'll just answer from the CIHR perspective. We don't lobby government. So we don't, you'll see advocacy groups lobby government. We talk amongst ourselves. We work very closely with Sarah and others, but we don't lobby for funding for particular programs. So that has to come from the community. And there are lots of examples of how the community, and I don't think it's just tenured professors, it's people who are advocating in that space, lobby the government, and funding is available. The Terry Fox Foundation's been very good at it. Cancer groups have been very good at it. So I think, that's one of the messages that this audience needs to be the vehicle with groups like CAPE to lobby for change. It won't come from CIHR. That's not the job. We're apparently part of the team, and what is it? Teamwork makes the dream work?
I think I'll respond with an example. Jennifer, I'm looking at a totally different case, not COVID-19, but Mpox. And, we had an outbreak develop in a non-endemic context in Canada. We did not have a lot of local expertise. We certainly had expertise when it came to the epidemiology and all of the epidemiological methods, but not in terms of pox viruses. For example, we didn't have a program on pox viruses set up at the National Microbiology, on mpox set up at the National Microbiology Lab. We didn't have deep expertise domestically. We also had the outbreak that was really within a particular population, within gay, bisexual men that have sex with men primarily, not exclusively, but primarily. We had a containment within, the outbreak was in Montreal and in Toronto and some cases in between. So there were some geographic isolation as well. So what did we do? We started off by initiating a systematic review of the literature. So my office initiated that and funded it to be able to scan what evidence was already published from endemic and also non-endemic countries. We had some internal assessment around what difference what the transferability rather of the non-endemic of the evidence from endemic countries was to the non-endemic context. So that was around science sense-making, essentially, in terms of a function. Where there were continued gaps in knowledge, which there certainly were in this case, we assembled an expert panel, which included not only academic-based experts, but also experts from local public health, where the most germane local, as Corey said, germane local intelligence was being generated. That was co-convened by myself and Dr. Tam to be able to actually do some collective sense-making around what we know from the published literature, what we know from the local data, and what those two things mean for the generation of public health guidance and communication to the public about risk. And we created an adjacent community panel where we pulled together relevant community-based organizations working with the populations of interest in order to help tailor our communications, and also both in terms of how the message was crafted, but also who it was going to be able to reach, and to work through, as was mentioned by my colleague, credible messengers and credible organizations with established relationships to those communities of interest. And all of that was part of an ongoing real-time process. So we met repeatedly with that panel. We maintained a living review because we were accruing evidence as we were making decisions, and that was fed into science communications efforts around the risk, for whom, under what conditions, and what could actually be done to mitigate it. So that's a very timely example of sort of the evidence support system that wrapped around a very real-time public health issue. If we look at that within the context of COVID-19, I mean, we're talking about a whole different scale and scope. I didn't bring slides this morning, although in hindsight, wish I had, because there's a couple of very compelling evidence cases around the sheer volume and scope and scale and pace of evidence that was being generated during the pandemic. So evolving evidence base, evolving public health measures and guidance base, evolving communication landscape, evolving tolerability of the public to action. All of those were sort of meeting, and there will be a lot of lessons learned around the complexity of that science communication case, to be sure.
It's great. It would be great if researchers in the trenches had a blueprint for how to do the monkeypox. That was a great example. So how do we do that? Because, I mean, is there a blueprint that we can follow if confronted with the same type of issue again? How do we bridge the gap? Because most of us don't know. And so I guess that would be really my request or suggestion.
Thanks for that's really good insight, Jen, and also sharing that example. Very good. Unfortunately, we're out of time for more questions, but please come up and ask the panelists directly or comments, or engage with others here with questions that you have. And I think we're all aware that when you're planning a research project, there's a section there. What's your knowledge translation plan going to be? And now you've just heard exactly what you need to write. Develop relationships. And no, it's certainly a challenging area, and I thought it was really an important thing for us to discuss as we think more about messages going forward. So I really appreciate everybody's attention so far this morning, and I really want to also thank all our panelists online and here in the room, and so thank you very much.